Great. Can I welcome you all this evening to the Blavatnik School of Government? We have that music on the countdown, which has us all on tenterhooks, just as we come into land. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you and to welcome Dr. Asanga Welikala. My name is Tom Simpson. I'm a faculty member here at Blavatnik School. I'm a philosopher by discipline, and it's my real pleasure to host a project on international perspectives on conservatism, very generously supported by the Open Society Foundations. And the goal behind the project is to think about, firstly, in some general sense, what is the future of the right from a normative, perhaps an ideological perspective, but to do so in an international perspective, which I think is very often missed out in these discussions. Obviously, we're here in the UK. It's great to be here. We are now a kind of outpost of the American empire, so American politics washes up over us very frequently, which we're delighted to explore. But this is specifically an attempt to broaden the conversation. And so to that end, it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Asanga Welikala, as I mentioned. Asanga is a senior lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Edinburgh, where he's been for a number of years, studied for his doctorate here in the UK as well. He also has a lot of experience of constitution writing and revising. And that experience started off in Sri Lanka, where he was advisor to the peace process around the 2002-2003 period, and went from there to the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq, 2004-2005, helping with the process of advising through the UN on constitution writing to Iraq at that time. And that engagement then led him to a series of other constitution writing engagements. And that's really been a source of experience and a prompt for reflection. So what we're going to do tonight is Asanga will speak for about 15-20 minutes or so. He and I will then have a little bit of back and forth question and discussion here, and then we'll open it up to questions, both from those in the room and those who are online. Warmly welcome those who are online. So that's the game plan. And Asanga, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks. Good evening, and thank you very much for that. Welcome, Tom, and for inviting me to speak in this series. And thank you all for being here, and welcome to those online as well. It's certainly a greater attendance than I'm usually used to when speaking about themes of conservatism. But perhaps things are changing, and there is a greater interest, I think, in discourses, particularly in comparative constitutionalism and constitutional government, about discourses that are beyond the hegemonic ideology, so to speak, of liberalism that has held sway for a good 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. So thanks again, Tom. And in these brief remarks at the very beginning, I will try to do 4 things. First, I will try to provide an account of the 3 waves of historical development through which political expressions of constitutional government have evolved in the global South since the end of the Second World War, and that period is significant because of the onset of decolonization. Secondly, I will try to sort of outline theorize the underlying institutional sort of normative core of something that I call post-colonial modernist constitutionalism that has remained constant despite the institutional variations of the 3 big waves of constitution making in the post-colonial world since 1945. Thirdly, I will suggest that this model might be running out of road, modernist constitutionalism, in the major global realignment of power that we are seeing since the 17th century, with the shift of power and prestige to Asia particularly, and what specifically conservatism can add to this debate through a critique of modernist constitutionalism. 4th thing that I will try to do is to outline the elements of a conservative alternative to modernist constitutionalism embodied in a normative focus on the common good as opposed to liberal individualism or socialist egalitarianism that have the potential to answer requirements of discourse practice of comparative constitution. That is both the making of constitutions as well as the task of governing constitutionally in the global south. So while most of my talk is about these counterpost ideological positions of liberal individualism and socialist egalitarianism, let me also point out very clearly at the very beginning that the conservatism, and it will become clear, I hope, as we go along, that the conservatism I talk about is very, very different from the unthinking, uncritical application of phrases like conservatism or right-wing to discourses that are seen in the global south, which are more to do with ethno-nationalism and other forms of authoritarianism. These are discourses of unconstitutional government, and conservatism, in the way that I see it, has nothing to do with that. So with those preliminary remarks, let's sort of try and trace post-war comparative constitutionalism in the global south. Constitutionalism in the global south, and that's a clumsy phrase, but it's a convenient one to mean the world outside of the West. Constitutionalism in the global south, that is both legal constitutions and conceptions of constitutional government in the states that began their modern independent existence after the reorganization of the global order after World War II, can be historically periodized according to three broad phases. I will call these decolonization, post-decolonization, and post-Cold War constitutions. So to begin with, at the beginning, decolonization. Decolonization constitutionalism was truly the first world historical movement of universalism in terms of foundational principles and organizing concepts. Under the new United Nations system, established after the end of the Second World War, constitutional statehood internationalized and universalized the Westphalian conceptions of territory, nation, state, and sovereignty. Beyond these foundational principles, however, this was not a phase of universalism in terms of either constitutional design or constitutional government. Post-colonies tended to emulate the constitutional model of the departing colonial power, such that Anglophone countries mostly adopted the Westminster model, or Francophone countries a version of semi-presidentialism. And as such, there were striking sub-global regional similarities in institutional design and norms of constitutional government. In this sense, the imprint of the previous imperial division of the world was constitutionally reflected in the immediate post-colonial world. One commonality, however, was the notable proceduralist character of these constitutions. I mean, they were not exactly value neutral. Most favored the basic commitments required for a political democracy of some sort, but they were notably not normatively thin in respect of other social, cultural, and economic values. Now, next is the more interesting one is the post-decolonization phase of constitutionalism. Many post-colonial states undertook a process of constitutional revision, which often also involved constitutional rupture from any surviving legal links to the former colonial power at some point after independence. In the British post-colony, the most striking thing constitutionally about this phase was the move to formal republicanism, although in some, the Republican form only served to clothe the introduction of monarchical presidentialism. But more generally, the common theme of this phase of reconstitutionalization was the instrumentalizing of the legal constitution to a thicker set of normative commitments than in the decolonizing phase. This instrumentalism commonly took the form of more explicit commitments to ethnocultural identities, economic socialism, and developmentalism. Attempts to constitutionalize identity in communally plural polities were fraught exercises which often weakened rather than strengthened the state's capacity to contain or manage conflict. And as more and more communally plural post-colonial states entered a period of protracted ethnic or religious conflict, the legitimacy and efficacy of these states would suffer lasting damage. Developmentalism in this period could take both democratic and non-democratic forms, and thicker or thinner conceptions of socialism. But shared assumptions in states that took this direction included the proposition that, for a grounded and meaningful politics in the post-colonial state, development was more important than democracy or pluralism, and that to this end, strong, which is to say unfettered or only weakly fettered political executives, more important in constitutional design than impartial civil or public services, functioning legislatures, or effective judiciaries. This, almost by definition, led to constitutionally imbalanced political systems, which often produced authoritarianism, corruption, state capture, governing incompetence, factionalism, violent internal conflict, an increase in the agency costs of government, and a reduction in the capacity for the production of public goods of the constitutional system. There was a, so that's the bad story of constitutional development in this phase in the global South. There was a more constructive aspect to constitutional instrumentalization, however, at least on the face of the paper constitutions in this phase. Post-decolonization legal constitutions began to talk increasingly about some conception of the common good, based on the idea that constitutional order has a moral purpose to secure peace, justice, and abundance. Whether in preambles, founding provisions, or in a common design device of this phase, contrajudicative constitutional directives, many, although by far not most, legal constitutions began to reflect a concern for the concept of the common good. But while the fundamental conceptual commitment might have been shared, the specific conceptions of the common good reflected in these constitutions were many. They reflected local, regional, and cultural aspirations to religious, mostly Christian, many Christian Roman Catholic countries, but also Islamic and Confucian conceptions of the common good, but also Republican, democratic, socialist, social democratic, and even in some cases liberal conceptions of the common good were there in these textual provisions talking about this concept in this phase of constitution making. Depending on the particular conception, they were intended to serve a progressive or a conservative purpose. That is, have a ruptural and transformative effect on the future from the past and the present, or have the conservative effect of continuing and preserving from the colonial order ideas of right, duty, authority, and public and private will. The third phase of constitutional development is the post-Cold War phase. This phase of constitutionalism sees the normative convergence of constitutions and good constitutional governance around liberalism on a global scale. The major constitutional norms of this convergence are the liberal ideals of individual autonomy and state neutrality, embedded within what is now thought to be a post-ideological consensus around positive human rights, the rule of law, limited government, and free markets. This ideal is also given effect through an institutionally explicit regime of separations in the horizontal and vertical organization of the state, most strikingly in the new imperative of judicial supremacy, and more broadly between the state and other domains such as society and the market. Behind it is a more implicit but characteristically liberal separationist mentality with regard to the public-private divide, the purpose of which, contrary to older conceptions of both colonial and post-colonial constitutional law, is always to constrain the public and liberate the private. The political liberalism of these constitutions further deals with the democratization and conflict resolution around twin or dual transitions from authoritarianism to democracy and from conflict to peace. Institutional design becomes an exercise in contextual variations of a common core of prescriptions, which includes essentially a written, legal, and supreme constitution establishing electoral democracy, positive civil and political rights, the separation of powers and strong form judicial review, and may include supplementarily fourth pillar institutions, federalism of some sort, and justiciable socioeconomic and cultural rights. Even though there is a lot of substantive and institutional variations between these three historic phases of constitutional development, decolonization, post-decolonization, and post-Cold War, my submission is that they are informed by a consistent theoretical core, which I call modernist constitutionalism, and I call them any number of other things as well. And let me now outline what I mean by this, followed by an enumeration of the objections a conservative understanding of constitutional government might mount against this conception. The making and implementation, as well as the study of constitutions since 1945, have been framed by a normative institutional model called Modernist constitutionalism, which originates in the French and American encounters with the European Enlightenment. There was a distinctive British encounter with it, but even in the British post-colony, that particular understanding of what modernity meant and what the Enlightenment meant for constitutionalism is very conspicuous by its absence. Between 1945 and 1991, the ideological traditions of liberalism and socialism that were otherwise engaged in an existential geopolitical conflict were nevertheless united by a common subscription to the universalist postulates of post-Enlightenment constitutional modernity. At a basic level of generality, modernist constitutionalism is defined by the rejection of tradition, hierarchy, and organicism, the sources of pre-modern small c constitutions, and the celebration of empiricism, egalitarianism, and transformation as the basis and purpose of modern big Z constitutions. In their understandings of constitutional foundations, liberalism and socialism were agreed on these modes and ends of modernity, but they differed on the means and forms through which the shared ends might be achieved. With the triumph of the West in the Cold War after 1991, the socialist variant of modernism withered and liberal constitutionalism subsumed constitutional modernism as a whole. The post-Cold War ascendancy of liberal constitutionalism was manifested in three major movements in transnational constitutional practice. First, the explosion in the number of written legal constitutions through the spread of the practice of transformative constitution making. Second, the increasing normative and institutional convergence in the foundation and structures of these legally posited constitutions in otherwise highly diverse political, cultural, and historical settings. And the third and complementary movement in liberalism's normative subsumption of constitutionalism was the expansion, institutionalization, and increasing specification of the regime of international human rights law, which began to play a kind of complementary role with domestic constitutional rights regimes and the international level. Contemporary constitutional design exhibits the doctrinal hallmarks of the liberal constitutionalism that at the heart of comparative constitutional law, which saw its greatest period of growth in this period. The Constitution is a written legal instrument enjoying supremacy over other laws and political practices. The making of a constitution marks a break, if not a rupture, in historical continuity, whereby the new constitution provides the exclusive basis of the legal identity of the new society. In this sense, the Constitution also transforms, hence transformative constitution making, transforms the society it serves by eradicating or ameliorating the traditions, the hierarchies, and the injustice and unreason of the past, and by instantiating liberal modernity's reason, liberty, equality, and justice. Inherited virtue ethics are arcane, morally and scientifically questionable, or irrelevant, whereas modernity's values, on account of their normative superiority, are expressed in enforceable form in the legal constitution. At the level of institutions, aside from procedural democracy, the major focus of the post-war constitutions has been bills of justiciable fundamental rights and strong form judicial constitutional review. Rights, moreover, as I already mentioned, are internationalized in various ways, including constitutional interpretative injunctions to municipal courts and the expanding jurisdiction of suprastate bodies over the monitoring and adjudication of rights. These are, in short, a set of institutional prescriptions that can only come from a normative constitutional theory that draws not merely a temporal but a sharp analytical distinction between tradition and modernity, and sees the purpose of modern constitutionalism as the maximization of individual autonomy through constrained government and an open-ended catalog of preferably justiciable legal rights. Now, that's a very short description. I've skipped a lot of nuance here, but hopefully you get the idea. But before we begin any normative discussion about conservative objections to this idea of modernist constitutionalism, we need to have a serviceable idea of what conservative constitutionalism is. And for this, we need an analytic conceptualization of conservatism as a constitutional ideology that can speak to the full diversity of the world in a comparatively meaningful fashion. Approached in this way, we can say that comparative constitutional conservatism has two core features. A commitment to incrementalism as the preferred method of constitutional change. Put another way, the concern is about managing and controlling change, with the burden of proof put on those people who want to make change to make the case for it. B, a belief that forces beyond human will and reason shape social and political institutions, that will and reason are not the sole determinants of either constitutional order or constitutional outcomes. And that may be God, that may be biology, that may be tradition, that may be all sorts of things beyond human reason and will. From this perspective, we can now set out the following propositions as conservative objections to modernist constitutionalism. And this is my idiosyncratic one. Constitutional order, properly understood, is not solely based on reason and will, and the legitimacy of constituted authority does not flow exclusively from the general will of the people. Constitutionalism, properly understood, is not just a normative project for the maximization of individual autonomy. Constitutional morality is much more than private autonomy, and the legitimacy of constitutional order does not flow exclusively from the legal constitution's promotion of private autonomy. Next, liberal constitutional morality is not neutral, as it purports to be. It is a substantive conception of the good, which conceals its dominating ambitions behind the guise of neutral proceduralism. Next, the proper purpose of constitutional order is not merely to constrain government, but also to enable good government for social ends. Obligations of obedience are not solely based on individual choice. Positive law alone cannot fully account for nor exhaust the principles of justice evolved by humankind over several millennia according to the needs of their own contexts. So it's an anti-positivist position. Those needs and principles are reflected in the embodied experience of cultures, which may share universal principles at high levels of abstraction, but are determined and expressed according to local specificities. The reality of global order is moving from convergence around the supposed universality of modernist constitutionalism towards a deeply plural order, specifically a pluriversal world, that is one that is ontologically plural in terms of conceptions of constitutional order. Now, if these negative propositions vis-a-vis modernist constitutionalism are accepted, the question then arises as to what conservatism as a constitutional ideology can be said to positively represent, taking into account that a general account of conservative constitutionalism has to be articulated at a fairly high level of abstraction in the context of the ontological pluriversalism just mentioned. I submit that the idea of constitutional government as being ordered to the idea of the common good is the unifying theme of different conservative iterations of constitutionalisms across the world. And these may come from Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, Jewish, all sorts of other religious and normative conceptions of the good. So let's, in this last couple of minutes, just let me try and outline what I think are the elements of this. The political unity embodied in the constitutional state is not a mere aggregation of privatized individual and federalized communal interests held together by a minimalist framework of procedural toleration. That's the standard liberal model that has served comparative constitutional law in the post-Cold War world. I submit that it is rather an indivisible whole bound together by the moral, political, economic, and juristic principles of justice required in a society that values freedom and responsibility equally. Although often marred and obscured by colonial and post-colonial constitutional cultures of tyranny and avarice, cruelty and violence, those principles of justice inhere in every post-colonial society's temporal and spiritual heritage. And with some careful work, they can be excavated from the past and reconstructed for the present. Given coherent articulation in the domain of public law, these claims are encapsulated in some theory and constitutionalism for the common good of that polity. A constitutional order oriented to the common good is one that is directed towards human flourishing through the provision of dignity, equality, peace, order, good government, and prosperity for every member of society and society as a whole. And the "and" is really very important. The common good is a universal value recognized in every global tradition of law and politics since ancient times. However, its instantiation, which is to say its interpretation and application to any particular polity, can and should be mediated through the history and culture of that polity. The common good is a unitary good in that it is both shared and indivisible within a society. It is the opposite of both a utilitarian good and an aggregative or majoritarian good. Therefore, the individual benefiting from the common good does not prevent access to it by others and does not reduce its availability to others. This is, in my view, a better conception of constitutionalism than those directed to the maximization of the autonomy of the individual or to egalitarian collectivism. And it is definitely morally superior to conceptions of non-constitutional political order, ethno-nationalism, and various other forms of authoritarianism that we see making a resurgence in the world. And these permit in various ways public authority to be utilized for private or socially selective ends. And that is the core objection that common good / conservative constitutionalism will have against these non-constitutional conceptions of political power. They don't make the difference between legal authority and political power. Political power is all there is. Constitutional government is not only about protecting rights and constraining government, but also about empowering and enjoining constitutional authority, both legal and political, to ensure peace, justice, and abundance. A constitutional state oriented to the common good in the above ways cannot be neutral as to the ends of politics and law. It is morally committed to achieving the common good in the temporal life of the community. In a well-ordered society, according to these principles, the individual and the community do not stand in opposition to each other, but are co-constitutive of each other. What is good for the individual is inseparable from what is good for the community. Individuals enjoy equal dignity and moral equality, which are actualized when both legal and political institutions act according to fundamental and prudential principles that protect and further the interests of everyone in the community, not just the minority. A flourishing, and when a constitutional order is founded on these lines and functions according to these lines, you have a flourishing society, which is also one that is characterized by civic friendship, trust in order and authority, and thriving social institutions beyond the state. And this kind of contextualized theory of common good constitutionalism in each polity establishes each polity's ethical framework for the making of constitutions and governing constitutionally. I stress that it is one that preserves the liberty of the individual while advancing what is good and fair for the political community as a whole, as coterminous rather than conflicting ends, and that this is a prudential ideal of good government that is very often organic to the traditions of political thought, both spiritual and temporal, that constitute the post-colonial constitutional heritage. For example, it is a concept that is prominent in Buddhist and Christian, Confucian, Hindu, Islamic, and Jewish conceptions of good government and political prudence. And it suffuses the juristic principles of the Western colonial legal inheritance in both public and private law in the post-colony. It is integral to the classical legal principles of peace, justice, and abundance inherent in the civilian legal tradition, and the well-known legal term of art found across Commonwealth constitutions, peace, order, and good government. One of the cornerstones of constitutional government in the English common law is a cognate expression, in my view, for order founded on the common good. So the point that I'm trying to make here simply is that in the coming world order, where a teleological understanding of the inevitable triumph of liberal constitutionalism can no longer be taken for granted, even if it ever could be. In that sense, going back to the 1990s, Huntington probably was more prescient than Fukuyama in terms of the world, but we don't have to necessarily also agree that the civilizations have to clash. If we know how to understand civilizational dialogue better, and one of the most promising ways of doing this, at least in the limited domain of constitutional government, is to try and explore how our universal search for constitutional orders that promote the common good might be instantiated and answered in different ways according to the ethical normative inheritances that inhere in every polity in the global south.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asanga. Asanga, thank you very, very much indeed. So I'm just conscious of time and I want to give plenty of time for discussion collectively and openly, but I've got two questions, if I may, just to start the discussion. So just thinking from a liberal perspective, what a liberal might say in response, and I guess one of the instincts might be every society has its elites, which play a role in governance. Some societies benefit from responsible elites who exercise their power on behalf of the public, and other societies have what you might call extractive elites. So they're using their position of power to pull resources to themselves at the cost of those they govern. And I guess the liberal thought is that individual rights give not only a principled basis for resisting that, but also an institutional pathway to create pressure on extractive elites. So there's a set of institutions which generate pressure towards reform of that. What's the institutional pressure that common good constitutionalism, as you're advocating for, what's the institutional pressure that it generates towards reform, away from extractive elites towards responsible elites?
Yeah, I mean, I think the liberal way of doing this is very well known, and I don't impute the good intentions of liberal constitutionalism in trying to address this problem of extractive elites. But let me tell you straight away, conception of constitutional order that is about the common good is the very opposite of all of the consequences of having extractive elites in a given political culture. If you look at almost any sort of account of common good constitutionalism, whether that comes from the national law tradition, the Western Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, or any other non-Western tradition, you find a very explicit articulation of the antonyms of the common good, right? And that involves tyranny and avarice and corruption, or put it in more modern terms, corruption, authoritarianism, state capture. Essentially the utilization, the capture of public power and the utilization of public power for private ends, right? Either of the ruling cabal or a plutocratic elite that supports it. All of these things are, conceptually speaking, complete antonyms of the common good. The common good means public power is used for public purposes, the public good, the common good. So at the conceptual level, certainly, yes, that's what it is. And then once you design institutions based on that, remember the core idea is simply this, that a constitution designed on common good may not, the difference between liberalism and my view is simply that we just don't have the obsession with using, through justiciable positive rights and individual autonomy as the basis of dealing with that problem. In fact, I think that's an inappropriate and misdirected way of dealing with the problem of extractive elites. You need to go much more deeper and much more generally into the problem of that by reordering the very idea of constitutional government to the common good, such that you exclude extractive elites and their agendas from the domain of what is respectable political action.
Okay, so this really segues into my second question, and these are actually not planned. I haven't declared them in advance to Asanga, but it's a very neat segue. So I'm just trying to think about the difference this would make in practice. So it'd be really interesting to hear about your experience of working with the UN mission in Iraq, in Baghdad during that time. Obviously, the Ba'ath regime prior to 2003 had, in some sense, held a lid on some quite deep cleavages within Iraqi society, which with its forcible removal by the invasion, then those cleavages, there were significant political consequences from that. So just an invitation to reflect on, firstly, what you think went wrong at the time, and then secondly, how things could have been done differently and better. If knowing what you do now, with the sort of benefit of hindsight that you have, how would that have been done differently?
Yeah, how many hours have you got? Well, yeah, I mean, look, I'll use this as a sort of, opportunity to also to sort of reprise a conversation that we had a little earlier. At that point in my career, and when I went into Iraq, I had grown up and worked in my own country, Sri Lanka, which throughout my life had been engaged in a civil war. We had seen the deleterious consequences of ethno-nationalism, of bad government, of elective authoritarianisms. And in the context of the ideas that were available to us, we had all, Shamara Vettumuni, Sri Lankan historian, is here. We all thought that liberal constitutionalism was a very good thing, and this was the only way of dealing with these terrible, discourses of power around nationalism and socialism and authoritarianism. And when I went into Iraq, of course, this was the height. I mean, in retrospect, it was the kind of apogee of a movement after the Cold War, where the neoconservative version of liberal constitutionalism had decided that just promoting this liberal constitutionalism through ordinary processes of diplomacy and development aid, etc., was not enough. You could actually use military force to do this, emboldened by the successes in Kosovo and Sierra Leone and some of these places. Throughout this time, I was an undergraduate and then working in public law, think tanking in the global south. I was fully bought up. I was a liberal until getting mugged by reality in Baghdad. When you realize that you can't go into a society and even tell those people who would quite rightly, having had the experience that we did not have of the obscene cruelty of a regime such as Saddam's and every Ba'ath regime before that, that getting rid of him is a good idea, but replacing that with a constitutional order which was all about the promotion of individual autonomy was never going to work, because to the extent that there is some conception that is organic to Iraqi society and the broader region in the Islamic world, they have a very well-developed jurisprudence for several thousand years, which is as old sometimes as the Western one. And it has very little to do, however, with the particular distilled export model of liberal constitutionalism that underpinned what was meant to be Iraqi constitutional reconstruction after the deposition of Saddam and the invasion. So in retrospect, I see that that's when I first began to really realize that liberalism is just one conception of constitutional government. There are many others. But if you're going to successfully move a country from unconstitutional and authoritarian rule and its consequences, you had to really look within that society to what its own conceptions of its normative ideals were about what might be good government and good constitution. Now, the real tragedy of the Iraqi experience, of course, was that that was a horrific one. And you and I both spent time in that country, and you in the military may have seen this even more than I did. So that's basically the point. I think that a conservative view, because we don't have the sharp distinction between tradition and modernity. We know that liberalism is something that came to us after the Enlightenment, but constitutionalism was there before. And not only in the Western tradition of political theory from Aristotle onwards and all of that, but also in the East and in Asia. These are matters to which political traditions of political theory have given a lot of thought. So in this next phase, as the world changes, I think, we have to realize that the great appeal of the idea of constitutional government is one thing, and that is universal, which is that unconstrained power, unfettered power is a bad thing. But the way that you deal with that differs according to different philosophical traditions, different cultures. In Iraq, it just had to happen in the way that it did. I don't think there could have been a course correction at that point of time. We just hadn't started thinking along the lines that we are doing now. It's in fact only after the retreat from Afghanistan in 2021, where I think historically that era came to an end finally, that we have begun to realize, so why did we do what we did? Use Western military dominance to go in and try to establish liberal constitutionalist or regimes that looked a bit like that, didn't work, and then there's an ignominious exit. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Shall we do this a bit differently now?
Yeah. Okay, great. Let me go to questions, open it up to the floor. So do just sort of catch my eye, put your hand up. I'll build up a list of people to go first, but Jacob, invite you first.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm going to mention very briefly, there is a new Conservative thought reading group next Friday at 4 p.m. in the Manor Road building, or afterwards. So my question concerns the this issue of kind of worrying with common good constitutionalism. There is a risk one might end up throwing out certain things that might be retrieved from a broadly liberal order that might have some value, detached from the framework of maximizing autonomy. So the thought here would be that, well, we can say there is a common good, and this common good in part is indivisible, and it has maybe a collective component, but do we want to also affirm the claim that, for instance, Adrian Vermeule affirms that it is the highest good of the individual? Do we want to affirm some version of the claim that the individual's good is somehow exhausted by the society's common good? Or do we want, is there room in common good constitutionalism to still say that, well, just because a society is flourishing doesn't necessarily mean the individual is? I mean, how do we, without going into the framework of maximizing autonomy, still preserve, if one wants to, certain aspects of the individual's good as a claim against the common good, if that makes sense?
Yes and no. In this sense, the first line of response perhaps is to say to you that at the level of the first principle among first principles, what distinguishes liberalism from some version of common good? I mean, just as much as there's no single version of liberal constitutionalism, there are many nuances and gradations within it. So in common good constitutionalism as well. So for example, when I say common good constitutionalism, I may not mean the same thing that Adrian Vermeule famously is talking about in terms of the American context and his philosophical inspiration and all the rest of it. I can't assume in many of the societies that I work in that there is for example, a Christian cultural inheritance, which is a precondition in my view for the Vermeulean conception for the American context. And he's doing a particular job with a particular version of interpretative theory in the American conservative tradition and all of that. So that's very specific. But at the more general level, the whole point is that liberal constitutionalism and many liberal constitutionalists actively and violently disagree when I say this. Ultimately, what it boils down to in terms of its coherence is the idea that when there is a conflict ultimately between the individual and the community, the individual has to win. That is my understanding of what distinguishes liberal constitutionalism from everything else. That is the reason why when liberals talk about rights and the limitation of rights, they have to go into all sorts of aggregative methods of deciding what the legitimate limit on a right is, because in their view, the presumption is that the right otherwise should be absolute. They concede as a concession to reality that you may need to restrict it, but then it is done according to some sort of aggregation. of the public interest that might, for a little while, justify a limitation on a right. The common good approach is fundamentally different in the sense that it does not see the individual and the polity in which she lives as counterpost. Right? So at every turn, every decision of legal or political authority takes into account what is the interest, the private interest of the individual, and including groups, cultural groups, and so on. If you look, in the global South, we have to deal with legally plural, cultures. There are Hindu and Buddhist and other kinds of territorial and personal, laws always coexisting, several legal systems coexisting within the framework of one single thing the whole time. So we are very used to thinking in terms of balancing at every given situation where you have to make a decision of a constitutional kind, that the interest of the community as a whole, society as a whole, probably the interest at the intermediate level of the cultural community to which the individual belongs, as well as the individual, all has to be balanced together. So from the get-go, so depending on the context and depending on the decision that is being made, the balance may, it may fall on one or the other, and it may be an amalgamation. But the assumption simply that absent a good enough reason that the right of the individual is the thing that must prevail is not there. I hope that's an answer, but it's a, yeah.
Okay, I'm keen to get other questions as well. We may come back to this if there's opportunity, but I think Richard?
Thank you, so that's fascinating. You began, I think, and then referred more than once to this, of the evil of ethno-nationalism. And then later on, you referred to political unity and obviously distinguishing particular political communities from a hegemonic international disposition. I just wonder how you contrast the evil of ethno-nationalism with the good of political unity, and what is a conservative constitutional government's sort of position on the importance of or limits of cultural unity, political unity? Speak to that.
Great. Conservatism, I think, is very comfortable with culture, and in the global South, beyond the legal domain, if you look at many, for example, Asian countries and African countries, characterized as a factor of daily life with tribal, ethnic, religious pluralism of a way in these societies which have not gone through that sort of 19th century process of national modernization as in Western Europe. This stuff is, day to day. We effortlessly, worship multiple gods and, participate in each other's cultural practices and all the rest of it goes on. I'm not saying that this is a hunky-dory world, right? I mean, this is another sort of fallacy. But nevertheless, there's a lot there. This is a very conservative disposition, small c conservative disposition in the sense that you are not anti-God, you're not anti-religion, you're not anti-culture. You can deal with things that sound very iffy from the various postmodern liberal perspectives that excluded from polite conversation in the West in a way that is entirely normal. And including in traditions of humor, which are used very effectively, in dealing with intercultural exchange. That's a very, in my view, a conservative way of dealing with sociology. And therefore, to me, the question becomes, for a constitutional lawyer, right? You have a demarcated territory which is a self-governing entity. So the territory is important in that sense. It's bounded. I don't think we have the luxury of going back to the pre-Western world in anywhere in Asia or Africa with unbounded, conceptions of pre-colonial statehood. For example, in Asia, there was a really fantastic conception of state called the mandala state or the galactic polity in the Buddhist Hindu world. It's an extraordinarily sophisticated state form which was meant to deal with this day-to-day existence of visible pluralism And so the whole logic of constitutional organization was very different. But we don't have the luxury of going back to all of that. But in the sense that we use the ancient constitution, some of that can be brought into practices, for example, of territorial management internally. Anyway, the point simply is conservatives are comfortable with organicism. Conservatives are comfortable with tradition. Conservatives do not make that sharp distinction between modernity and what went before. As a result, and we don't think that constitutional order is about making those sharp breaks under these newly reconstructed legal constitutions, then that must start transforming society according to the first principles of what liberalism thinks is the good society. Right? So that is what is conservative about it. So we can design constitutions that notionally look very, very similar. I mean, in just the same way, for example, in the Commonwealth world, Richard, as you know very well, we have frameworks in the older Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand, etc., which, in terms of their structures of authority a century ago, had nothing to do with liberalism. But those forms still exist, and they have, they are through discourses of interpretation and changes of political discourse and all the rest of it that have changed. So it's very much like this, in my view, in the global South as well. Constitutional forms that may look quite similar to what are associated with transformative constitutionalisms. But nevertheless, the way that we think about authority, the way that we exercise and justify constitutional decisions changes in this way.
Great, thank you. Samir, can I just get a show of hands for anyone else? I think we've got time for one more question after this as well. Okay, great. We'll come to Samir first. Speak loudly, please, so we can hear. Yeah.
I'm very interested in the role that rights play in your idea of common good constitutionalism. You mentioned the, post-Cold War wave. There was this justiciability of socioeconomic rights. At least there was part of that idea that was playing out. And then you also mentioned that the common thread in all of these three waves was the instrumentalization of human rights. And I wonder, and then in response to one of the questions, you mentioned that the substantial difference between common good constitutionalism versus a broad liberal idea of constitutionalism is that absent good reason, it's the individual autonomy, individual right that has primacy. And I wonder if that's true for all rights, because from how I see it, most of liberal constitutions and liberal constitutionalism frameworks prioritize the civil and political rights as opposed to socioeconomic rights, right? And then the principles that you gave of the common good constitutionalism, I feel they are a lot similar to what the ideas of liberal constitutionalism are, in the sense of constraining public authority, political power, etc., but minus this reluctance of liberal constitutions' idea of justiciability of socioeconomic rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, and it's a very familiar question, right? In global South constitutional discussions. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief and potentially incomplete answer. For me, the thing is simply this: what happened in the 1990s at the end of the Cold War was what had previously been a debate that had happened in the world of international human rights law and the schism, because the socioeconomic, the two the covenants were done, and the socialist world gave more prominence to the socioeconomic stuff, and the Western world to the other one. Now, at the end of the Cold War, and when these transitions and the practice of constitution writing and transformative processes started, we began to transpose international law more and more and more into becoming a core concern of constitutional design, right? And by this time, that whole principle of indivisibility of human rights, etc., had also started developing international law, and this was all brought into the new world of comparative constitutional rights, jurisprudence, and constitutional design stuff. The other thing that happened, of course, was, except the hardcore communists who had lost and had gone off into the darkness, a whole bunch of soft socialists began to populate the world of comparative constitutional law at this point in time, and you had to give them a concession and justiciable socioeconomic rights on the principle of that you can't, divide rights because the whole package had to come in one was, what explained all of this. So to me, that's what it is. The terms of the entry of former socialists into the world of constitutionalism at the end of the Cold War ensured that justiciable socioeconomic rights. Now, having said that, let me also tell you, I used to be, when I was a liberal, somebody who was completely opposed to the idea of socioeconomic rights, not because I was opposed to a fair society and the fair sharing of the economic common good, but because to me it was a horrendous expansion of the judicial role and a gutting of the democratic process and of the democratic institutions. As a result, you created juristocracies, particularly in South Asia. We've had this experience. That was my objection. But the more I began to think at the more foundational normative level about my understanding of what constitutionalism was, it is entirely possible for a common good constitutionalism to have these rights and make them justiciable, because we have a completely different idea about what the institutional role moralities of the branches are and what constitutionalism is supposed to do. So if it's always a question of balancing, and the judiciary knows its role, and there is no presumption that the individual interest must prevail unless there is some good reason, there is no problem at all, in my view, where the context so demands. And in many global South countries, economic inequality is a big deal, and a constitution will have to say something. There will be an expectation that they do. And the even more stronger argument, of course, is that many of these rights pertain, even in the liberal world, the way that they are used, to enhancing the quality of executive decision making, not so much the achievement of radical redistribution overnight.
For reasons of time, I think we'll end there. I always want to end on time. Asanga, it's been really fruitful. We've heard a little bit of your journey. It's been very stimulating to see. It's really great when we have a speaker who's changed their mind on something in the course of their life, and that's not something that one always manages to display. But we've really benefited from your reflections on that and the international perspective in particular that you brought. Would you join me in saying thank you very much to Dr. Welikala?